No one on that rescue team would ever forget the sight they found, dragging himself across a frozen wasteland, half conscious, half frozen, and somehow still alive. Lucas Warren had no right to survive a crash like that. The helicopter pilots who reported the wreckage assumed the bodies inside would be frozen solid by the time help arrived, but Lucas hadn't stayed inside the twisted metal of the plane. Instead, he had crawled out, inch by inch, through jagged wreckage, snow-filled wind, and bitter sub-zero temperatures, with one leg shattered so badly that every movement sent waves of agony through his body. What no one could understand, not immediately, was how he managed to keep going long after most people would have surrendered. Because survival wasn't just about the cold or the pain. The real terror came from the dark shapes he saw stalking him from the tree line. Shapes that breathed in slow, hungry circles around him as he crawled. Wolves. A whole pack. Starving, silent, calculating. They followed the injured man like he was the only warm thing left alive in that icy world. Before the disaster, Lucas had believed he understood fear, but nothing had prepared him for being prey in the wilderness. Injured, alone, and hunted. As Lucas dragged himself forward, the snow swallowing his hands and blood, marking a thin red trail behind him, he realized something chilling. The wolves were no longer following him. They were closing in. He could hear their low growls blending with the wind, smell their hot breath every time they stepped closer, and sense that they were simply waiting for him to weaken enough to finish what the crash had started. His survival was no longer a miracle. It was a countdown. And before we continue this story of impossible endurance and primal fear, take a moment to support this channel. If you love intense real-life survival stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments from which country and city you're watching. Your support helps us bring more stories of resilience, courage, and grit. Stories that remind us how thin the line is between life and death in the wild. Now, let's return to the frozen nightmare Lucas faced. Because the wolves were only the beginning, Lucas hadn't been supposed to be anywhere near the crash site. The flight was meant to be routine, a short transport run over the northern wilderness, the kind pilots joked about being boring enough to fall asleep on. But halfway through the journey, the sky darkened, visibility dropped, and a sudden mechanical failure turned a steady flight into a violent descent. He remembered the sound first, metal snapping, alarms blaring, someone shouting something he never understood. Then came the impact, hard, violent, blinding. When he woke up, his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the snow around him stained with oil and fire. The cold struck him like a slap, but survival instincts forced him to move. Flames licked the wreckage. The heat melted the snow enough to reveal the truth. He was the only one still breathing. And with the fire spreading toward leaking fuel, staying inside the plane meant dying. Crawling out meant taking his chances with a frozen, merciless world. He didn't know then what waited for him just beyond the burning metal. He didn't yet hear the soft crunch of paws in the snow. The wilderness around him was vast, empty and silent in a way that felt unnatural. Snow drifted like ashes falling from the sky, and the air tasted like metal and ice. Lucas's breaths turned into clouds that instantly crystallized. Every push forward sent needles of pain through his leg, but stopping wasn't an option. The fire behind him cast a dim orange glow, making shadows leap across the snow. At first he thought the moving silhouettes were tricks of the light, hallucinations brought on by shock. But when one of the shapes paused, lifted its head, and let out a slow, vibrating growl, the illusion shattered. Wolves, not one, not two, an entire pack. Gaunt, desperate, their ribs showing through their fur. They weren't attacking yet, but they were observing, calculating. Wolves don't waste energy chasing prey that will die on its own. And Lucas, struggling to breathe, legs shattered, body shutting down from cold, was exactly the kind of prey they waited for. He realized then that he wasn't just trying to survive the crash. He was trying to survive being hunted. Every survival story has a moment one that defines everything that follows. For Lucas, that moment came when he forced himself to crawl toward a narrow line of trees in the distance, the only possible shelter from the rising wind. He had no idea how far they were. 100 meters? 500? A mile? The cold played tricks on his perception, but he dragged himself anyway, fingers burning, lungs aching, vision flickering. Behind him, the wolves moved in a slow arc, adjusting their formation like seasoned predators. They weren't rushing him. They were herding him, steering him, guiding him toward the wilderness where they had the advantage. The realization hit him with a cold, sharper than the wind. He wasn't escaping. He was being cornered. And yet, even as fear clawed at his mind, something inside him refused to quit. Lucas wasn't ready to die, not frozen, not broken, and definitely not torn apart in the snow. So he crawled inch by inch into the night, knowing the wolves were matching every movement, and waiting for his strength to run out. Lucas Warren had always thought he understood the wilderness. As a bush pilot who had flown countless rescue missions over frozen valleys, jagged mountains, and unmarked stretches of northern forest, he considered himself familiar with its silence, its vastness, and its unforgiving moods. But nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for the moment the aircraft shuddered beneath him. First a tremor, then a violent twist that ripped control from his hands. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died, leaving the cabin wrapped in a suffocating stillness. The crash that followed was not a graceful descent, but a brutal, tearing collision with a merciless landscape. Metal crumpled, branches sliced through the fuselage, and snow exploded through every crack in the wreck. When everything finally stopped moving, Lucas lay half-conscious among the debris, the taste of iron in his mouth and a ringing pain spreading from the shattered bone in his leg. The world around him was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the skin. And as the fog in his mind began to lift, he understood two things with chilling clarity. He was alive, and he was trapped in the cold heart of the wilderness with no way to stand, no way to call for help, and no guarantee he would survive the night. For several long minutes, Lucas remained still, listening to the slow hiss of wind weaving through the broken ribs of the plane. The temperature was already dropping, the sky dimming into a bruised gray as daylight drained away. His breath hung in front of him in pale clouds, each one a reminder that warmth was escaping faster than he could conserve it. He crawled forward, dragging his injured leg across the icy floor of the shattered aircraft. Every movement sent shocks of agony up his side, but he refused to stop. He knew enough about the wilderness to understand that immobility meant death. Snow would collect, consciousness would fade, and within hours hypothermia would swallow him whole. When he finally reached the torn opening of the fuselage, he pulled himself out into the open air. The forest looked endless, trees rising like dark, silent pillars under a sky that felt too wide, too empty. Yet something about the emptiness felt wrong. Lucas could feel the weight of the forest watching him, as if the wilderness itself had paused to observe its newest intruder. He glanced back at the remains of the plane, his only shelter, now a mangled coffin of frozen metal. He needed warmth, food, fire, anything to keep him alive until morning. But before he could crawl further, a distant chilling sound drifted through the trees. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the cracking of ice. It was a low, guttural growl carried on the cold air, one that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. The growl reverberated through the stillness with an almost deliberate patience, as though whatever emitted it knew exactly how vulnerable Lucas was. He froze, breath caught in his throat, heart pounding in uneven bursts. The wilderness was home to many predators, lynxes, bears, even the occasional mountain lion. But this sound was different. It had rhythm, depth, and an unsettling intelligence behind it. With painful effort, Lucas propped himself up on his elbows, scanning the forest line. For several seconds he saw nothing but a curtain of snow drifting between trunks layered in frost. But then his gaze caught it. Movement. Slow, deliberate, circling, A silhouette, then another. Wolves. At least 3, possibly more, their outlines merging with the undergrowth like shadows given form. Lucas knew wolves rarely approached humans unless driven by starvation or desperation, and the gaunt shapes weaving between the trees confirmed exactly that. These creatures were hungry, too hungry to be cautious, and Lucas, crippled and bleeding, was the easiest prey they had seen in a long time. He forced himself backward, dragging his body toward what remained of the aircraft. His hands trembled as they clawed at the snow, every pull sending fire through his broken leg. The wolves moved closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the dimming light. Not attacking yet, just watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Lucas felt a cold dread settle over him, heavier than the snow beneath his palms. He had always respected the wilderness, but he had never felt hunted. Not like this. The wolves were silent now, their growls replaced by a predatory stillness. They studied him the way a storm studies the landscape before tearing it apart. Lucas reached the twisted frame of the plane and pulled himself inside, collapsing just beyond the jagged metal edge. The wolves did not retreat. Instead, they approached the wreckage, their paws making no sound on the snow. One stepped forward, its breath misting in the cold as it sniffed the air. Lucas held his own breath, praying the darkness inside the fuselage would hide him. But he knew that the scent of blood, his blood, was spreading through the air like a beacon. Wolves were patient, wolves were disciplined, and starving wolves were relentless. He needed a plan for survival, something beyond pure instinct. He forced himself to think. Food, fire, barriers, anything that could buy him time. But his body was weakening quickly, the crash having drained more strength than he realized. Yet even through the pain, he refused to surrender. Somewhere deep within him, a stubborn ember of determination flickered to life. He would not die here. Not like this. Not as prey. Night closed in swiftly, swallowing the last traces of color from the sky. Temperature plummeted, and Lucas's shivering grew violent, uncontrolled. The wolves had not left. He could hear them pacing outside the wreckage, their nails clicking lightly against frozen earth. Every few minutes one released a low growl, a reminder that they were still there, still waiting. Lucas pressed his back against the cold interior wall of the plane, forcing himself to stay awake. Hypothermia crept through him like a living thing, numbing his fingers, slowing his thoughts. But his will to survive clung fiercely to consciousness, refusing to fade. As the wind howled outside and the wolves circled in the darkness, Lucas understood the grim truth. This night would not be about escaping the wilderness. It would be about outlasting it. He was trapped, frozen, alone, and bleeding, yet still alive. And as long as he breathed, he had a chance, even if the hungry eyes watching from the shadows were waiting for his strength to fail. The storm had been stalking the horizon long before Lucas Warren realized it was a threat. From the cockpit of his small transport plane, he had watched the clouds gather like a heavy curtain drawing itself across the sky, gray deepening into slate, slate bruising into black. Pilots in this region always respected the weather. Here, the sky changed its mind faster than any forecast could predict. Lucas had flown enough missions across the northern wilderness to trust his instincts over instruments when it came to storms. But on this flight, his instincts were unusually silent, drowned out by the urgency of the cargo run he needed to complete before nightfall. What he missed in those early minutes was the subtle shift in the air pressure, the unnatural stillness rolling beneath the clouds, and the faint tremor in the wings. Each one a warning he only recognized once it was too late. As he crossed into the narrow valley below, wind slammed into the aircraft with a ferocity that knocked Lucas hard against his harness. The plane jolted violently, rattling like a toy shaken in a giant's fist. He gritted his teeth, tightening his grip on the yoke, trying to correct the angle. But the storm was not something he could simply fly around. It had swallowed the sky in every direction. Sheets of snow blurred the windshield, spinning sideways in chaotic spirals as wind roared across the fuselage. Lucas tried to climb, then descend, searching desperately for a pocket of calmer air. But every maneuver only worsened the turbulence. The altimeter needle flicked dangerously, warning lights flickered in the cabin. Then, in one final sickening lurch, the right engine coughed, once, twice, and died. Lucas felt the aircraft tip sharply to one side as the remaining engine strained to carry the weight. He tried restarting the dead engine, but the ignition sputtered uselessly. A metallic whine shrieked through the cockpit, followed by a burst of static across the radio. His hands moved automatically through the emergency procedures he had practiced countless times, but the plane was already losing altitude too fast. Snow-covered treetops rose toward him like jagged white spears. The only question now was not whether he would crash, but where, and whether he could angle the descent enough to avoid immediate death. He leveled the wings as best he could, gritting his teeth as the airframe buckled under the strain. A violent gust slammed into the plane, shoving it downward in a final merciless plunge. The first impact was deafening. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and the cockpit became a storm of debris. Branches tore through the fuselage like claws, ripping through panels and scattering equipment. Lucas's vision blurred as the plane skidded across the forest floor, plowing through snow and underbrush before colliding with a slope. The world spun, flipped, and finally slammed to a stop at a twisted angle. For several seconds after it ended, Lucas didn't know if he was still alive. All he felt was ringing in his ears and the crushing weight of the harness digging into his chest. Snow drifted in through a shattered side window, settling gently on his jacket like a mocking contrast to the violence of the crash. It took several long, disoriented breaths for Lucas to register the pain. Not the distant ache of bruises or cuts, but the sharp, nauseating agony radiating from his right leg. He looked down and immediately regretted it. The angle of the limb was unnatural, twisted beneath the collapsed section of the console. He reached forward with shaking hands and pushed at the metal, but the moment he shifted his leg even an inch, the pain shot through him with blinding force. Lucas bit down hard on the collar of his shirt to keep from crying out. Panic surged through him, quick, suffocating, instinctive. A broken leg in this environment was more than an injury. It was a death sentence, but panic never helped anyone survive. Lucas forced himself to take slow breaths, grounding his mind the same way he had taught countless rescue trainees. Assess, prioritize, act. He checked his torso. No swelling, no sharp abdominal pain, breathing steady enough. His arms were functional, though blood trickled from a deep cut on his forearm. He turned his attention to the cockpit around him, digging through the shattered remains for supplies. Most of the emergency gear had been crushed or thrown from the plane during the crash, but he found a small first aid kit wedged under the seat frame. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Bandages, gauze, alcohol wipes, a thermal blanket. Far less than he needed, but enough to slow his deterioration. As he wrapped the blanket awkwardly around his shoulders, the temperature inside the cockpit continued dropping. Already the cold was seeping into his bones, turning each breath into a stinging burn. He knew the first stages of hypothermia could set in within an hour, especially with an exposed wound and limited mobility. He reached for the radio unit, hoping desperately that at least part of the communication system had survived. Static crackled faintly, then died. He tried again. Nothing. The antenna was likely destroyed, buried somewhere outside the wreckage under snow and broken branches. Lucas closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. He was entirely alone. He needed shelter, fire, warmth, anything that would keep him alive through the first night. But moving meant dragging his shattered leg across the snow, and even the thought of it made bile rise in his throat. Still, he couldn't stay in the cockpit. The wind penetrated the wreckage through every crack, turning the cabin into a metal freezer. He reached up and carefully unlatched his harness, wincing as his body slumped sideways. He braced himself with one arm and began dragging his torso toward the opening. Each movement felt like tearing a blade through his leg, but he gritted his teeth and pushed on. Inch by inch, breath by breath, he crawled through the debris until the outside air hit him like a slap. The forest was eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling branches, only the distant groan of wind weaving between the trees. Snow had begun falling again, thickening into heavy flakes that blanketed everything in ghostly white. Lucas pulled himself a few feet from the wreckage and stopped to catch his breath. The pain in his leg throbbed in sickening waves, spreading upward into his hip. He scanned the forest, searching for anything that could serve as shelter. A fallen log, a depression in the ground, a cluster of pines thick enough to block the wind, but the land around him was flat and exposed. The best shelter he had was the wreckage behind him, a weak defense, but better than nothing. As he turned to crawl back toward it, something shifted in the shadows between the trees, a shape, a movement. He froze. At first he thought it was simply the forest settling, snow falling from branches, shadows shifting. But then he saw them, eyes, several pairs glinting faintly in the dim light, low to the ground, purposeful, unblinking. Lucas's stomach twisted. Wolves. Not a distant threat, not a hypothetical danger, real, immediate, and far too close. The animals watched him with chilling patience, their breaths forming pale clouds in the cold air. Lucas felt the ancient primal fear rise inside him, the instinctive awareness that he was no longer the apex predator. He was injured, alone, and bleeding. They knew it, and in that moment, as the wolves took their first slow steps forward, Lucas understood. The crash hadn't been the end of the nightmare, it had been the beginning. Lucas Warren woke to the sensation of snow settling softly onto his face, each flake stinging like a pinprick as it melted against his skin. For a moment he didn't remember where he was. All he saw when he opened his eyes was a dull gray sky pressing down through the fractured boughs of the trees overhead. Then the pain in his legs surged, sharp and all-consuming, dragging him back to reality with a brutal clarity. The crash, the bone-deep cold, the realization that help was not coming. He inhaled shakily and forced his mind to steady. He needed to think. The night had been long, colder than he anticipated, and he could feel stiffness creeping into his muscles. He had managed to drag himself a few feet from the shattered plane before exhaustion overtook him. Now, fully awake, he understood he couldn't remain exposed like this. He needed shelter, and he needed it desperately. Dragging himself back toward the wreckage required monumental effort. Every shift of his weight sent a jolt of agony through his broken leg. He gritted his teeth until his jaw throbbed and pressed onward, clawing through the snow with numb fingers. The fuselage, though mangled and half-collapsed, could still offer partial protection from the wind. Inside, he could gather what little remained intact. Water, maybe a thermal blanket, or something he could use to splint his leg. The cockpit was beyond salvage, crushed like a tin can upon impact, but the cargo area might still hold supplies. Lucas pulled himself closer, inch by inch, refusing to surrender to the despair simmering beneath his determination. Once inside the wreckage, he paused to catch his breath. The interior smelled of fuel and scorched insulation, a harsh chemical sting that made his eyes water. Loose wiring hung like vines, and the walls were bent inward where the plane had twisted upon landing. Still, there were pockets of space, enough for him to maneuver. He located a storage compartment and pried it open with trembling hands. Inside, he found a partially crushed metal water bottle, a torn emergency blanket, a small first aid kit, and a handful of protein bars. Relief flooded him so powerfully he nearly laughed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him alive for at least a couple of days. Enough to buy him time. He splinted his leg as best he could using a piece of broken paneling and strips torn from his shirt. The result wasn't pretty, nor particularly stable, but it held the bone in place and reduced the unbearable pressure slightly. Every movement still hurt, but at least now the pain wasn't blinding. As he worked, the forest remained silent, eerily so. No birds, no wind gusts, just the distant groan of shifting ice. Lucas was used to the wilderness sounding alive, even in harsh winter conditions. But here it felt watchful, as if the trees themselves were waiting for something. He dragged the emergency blanket around his shoulders and crawled toward the torn opening in the fuselage. From there he could see a long scar in the snow stretching down the slope. The path the plane had carved as it skidded into the trees. Deep grooves, crushed branches, and scattered debris marked the violent descent. But something else caught his eye. Tracks. Large ones. Circular pads with deep impressions. They circled the crash site in a wide arc, as though whatever made them had been inspecting the wreckage from a distance. Lucas's breath hitched as he studied the pattern. Wolves. At least 3 based on the spacing. And judging by the depth, they were heavy, possibly hungry. He scanned the tree line, his heart hammering. Wolves rarely approached humans unless food was scarce, and with winter deepening, prey might be limited. The crash could have drawn their attention. The noise alone might have attracted predators curious about the disturbance. Lucas swallowed hard. With his leg broken, he couldn't outrun them. He couldn't even climb a tree. His best chance would be to fortify the interior of the plane, making it harder for anything to enter. The exposed side of the fuselage was a massive vulnerability, a gaping wound the wolves could slip through easily if they were determined. He had to find something to barricade it. He crawled outside again, scanning the debris for anything that could be moved. Several luggage cases had survived the crash and were embedded in the snow nearby. They were heavy enough to create a partial barrier. Lucas dragged one toward the opening, inch by inch, every pull sending tendrils of fire through his wounded leg. It took nearly 40 minutes to get the first case into place, and by the time he was done, sweat had frozen on his skin in a thin layer of ice. But he continued. He dragged a second, then a third, forming a crude wall that, while far from wolf-proof, would at least slow them down. It was enough to make him feel like he had some control, some influence over his own survival. Once the barricade was built, he retreated inside the fuselage and examined what remained of the supplies. 3 protein bars, 1 bottle of water. The situation would become dire fast. He couldn't hope for rescue. He didn't know if his signal reached anyone before the crash, and even if it had, weather conditions might delay search teams for days. He needed to conserve everything he had. He broke off a small piece of the protein bar and forced himself to eat slowly, savoring what little calories he could ingest. Hunger, he knew, would weaken him faster than the cold. Night approached quickly in the wilderness, the sky darkening into a deep blue that seemed to swallow the light inch by inch. Lucas positioned himself near the center of the fuselage, wrapped in the emergency blanket, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. The temperature dropped sharply. His breath condensed in pale clouds. His leg throbbed endlessly. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on staying awake. Sleep would make him vulnerable, but exhaustion pressed heavily against his eyelids. It was then, on the edge of slipping into unconsciousness, that he heard it. A howl. Long, low, echoing through the trees like a warning. Another howl answered. Then another. Closer. Lucas's eyes snapped open. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it against his ribs. The wolves were near. Very near. He tightened the blanket around his shoulders and pulled himself deeper into the plane, positioning his back against the cold metal wall. The howls circled him, weaving through the forest like ghostly threads. They were not just passing through. They were tracking him, studying him, and as the night fully fell, Lucas Warren understood with chilling clarity. The wilderness wasn't waiting for him to die. It was watching to decide when. Lucas Warren pushed forward through the cold dirt, dragging his broken leg behind him as the forest swallowed the last traces of fading daylight. Every movement felt like tearing muscle from bone, like fire spreading through frozen veins. Hours earlier, he had believed the crash was the end of his suffering. But now, crawling beneath the shadow of towering pines, he understood how wrong he had been. His breaths came out in ragged gasps, fogging the air before him, and his fingers left thin, trembling grooves in the soft earth as he fought to continue. There was no sign of rescue, No hint of human presence, only the wilderness, and the low, terrible growl that had echoed behind him before the sky darkened completely. He had prayed that he had imagined the sound, prayed that it was merely wind sweeping between the trees or the settling of debris from the fallen plane. But as minutes passed, he began to hear them more clearly. Soft, rustling movements, light paw steps crunching the underbrush. A huff of breath carried by the cold. Wolves, more than one. Hungry, curious, and emboldened by the scent of blood rolling from his wounds. Lucas's heart hammered against his ribs, beating so loudly he feared it would echo through the night like a beacon. He forced his numb hands forward, dragging himself toward a cluster of boulders ahead, anything that might offer even the slightest shelter. Night fell quickly, and with it came a creeping tension that wrapped itself around Lucas's nerves like a tightening vice. The forest shifted. Sounds grew sharper, closer. Every twig snap triggered a jolt of instinctive fear. The pack was tracking him now, circling, closing in. They were patient hunters, far more patient than any predator Lucas had ever imagined facing. He whispered a trembling prayer, not expecting a miracle, but needing to speak to God if only to keep his mind anchored against terror. He asked for strength, for protection, and for clarity, because every step, every crawl, might be the last. He reached the rocks at last, pulling himself into the narrow space between two fractured granite slabs. It wasn't much, but it was something that might slow the wolves, force them to approach one at a time rather than all at once. He curled his injured leg close to his body, trying to dull the agony radiating from it. His breathing slowed as he pressed his back to the cold stone, listening. The forest had become too quiet. Silence, he realized, was worse than growls. Silence meant they were watching him, observing him, waiting for the moment he could no longer fight. Minutes stretched like hours. Lucas's eyelids grew heavy from fatigue and blood loss. He forced them open repeatedly, refusing to let unconsciousness claim him. He knew that if he fell asleep, the wolves would not hesitate. They would sense his vulnerability instantly. So he stayed awake, trembling violently, gripping a jagged stick he had picked up earlier. It wasn't a weapon. It was a whisper of hope. A piece of broken wood clutched by a broken man. Yet in the wilderness, even a whisper of hope was better than surrender. A sudden crack shattered the silence. Lucas froze. Another crack followed, branches snapping, leaves shuffling. Then a low growl, deep and resonant, rolled into the small shelter where he hid. His chest tightened as he slowly turned his head toward the darkness beyond the rocks. Two yellow eyes glowed from within the black, unblinking, fixed entirely on him. The wolf stepped forward, revealing its skeletal frame beneath thin fur, its ribs visible, its breath condensing in hot clouds that drifted into the cold air. Hunger radiated from it like heat from a furnace. Lucas pressed deeper into the crevice, though there was nowhere left to retreat. His trembling hand raised the stick, though he knew it was laughably inadequate against a predator like this. The wolf lowered its head, baring its teeth. It didn't lunge. Not yet. It was analyzing him, testing his reaction, waiting for the pack to regroup behind it. Lucas swallowed hard, fighting the crushing instinct to shut his eyes. He knew if he looked away even for a moment, he would lose what little control he had over the confrontation. "Lord," he whispered under his breath, "be my strength. I have nothing left." The wolf stepped closer. Its paws patted the soil softly, silently, as if it were a shadow given form. Lucas felt the warm rush of adrenaline surge through him, making his heart thud so violently it hurt. He could smell the wolf now, a mix of musk, damp fur, and the unmistakable scent of wild hunger. Behind it, more eyes appeared between the trees, glowing like dim lanterns. The pack had arrived. They surrounded him on all sides. There was no escape. Lucas tightened his grip on the stick, every cell in his body urging him to fight even if it was pointless. He refused to die lying down. Just as the wolf in front crouched, preparing to strike, an unexpected sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the forest. A sharp crack, loud enough to bounce between the trees. The wolves jerked their heads toward the noise, ears perked. Another crack followed, this time unmistakable. A human sound. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. Someone else was out there, someone approaching the crash site. The wolves hesitated, growls rumbling low in their chests as uncertainty flickered through the pack. For the first time since the crash, hope sparked inside Lucas like a faint, trembling flame. But hope brought confusion as well. Was the sound a rescuer, a hunter, or something far more dangerous? Lucas clung to consciousness, resisting the darkness that threatened to pull him under. The wolves repositioned themselves, torn between their prey and the unknown disturbance nearby. Lucas watched them, his pulse pounding. God hadn't abandoned him. Not entirely. Something was happening, something he didn't understand yet. But one thing was certain. The night was far from over, and the battle for survival had just begun. The forest held its breath as Lucas Warren pressed his back against the cold granite, the jagged stone digging into his bruised ribs. The wolves stood frozen in eerie stillness, yellow eyes flicking between him and the direction of the mysterious crack that had echoed through the night. For a moment, Lucas wondered if he had imagined it. If the sound had been nothing more than his mind fracturing under fear and exhaustion. But then it came again, sharper this time, like metal striking against rock. One of the wolves snarled uneasily. Nature itself seemed to ripple with tension, as though the forest sensed a presence it didn't recognize. Lucas dared to lift his head slightly, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. His vision blurred with pain and cold, but he strained his eyes against the night. A faint glimmer, like the reflection of moonlight against glass, appeared between the trees. The wolves immediately shifted their posture, their bodies lowering into cautious stances. They were not retreating, but they were no longer fully committed to attacking him either. Lucas's pulse raced. Whoever or whatever was approaching was disrupting the pack's rhythm. It was his only advantage. Fragile and fleeting, he whispered another prayer beneath his breath, asking God to shield him from both the predators he saw and the unknown that approached. The rustling grew louder, branches snapped, leaves scattered. Lucas's breath fogged the air as he peered into the shadowed tree line. A silhouette emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with purpose but not stealth. The wolves responded instantly with low, warning growls. Lucas's heart hammered. The figure stepped closer, and for a fleeting moment, Lucas thought he saw the glint of something metallic hanging from the person's side. A weapon? A tool? Hope and fear collided violently in his chest. The stranger paused only a few steps from the edge of the clearing, his outline framed by moonlight. "Easy," the voice said, deep and steady. "Easy now." The wolves reacted with agitation, snarling, pacing, circling. The leader of the pack, the same wolf that had first approached Lucas, lowered its head as though preparing to lunge at the newcomer. But the stranger didn't flinch. Instead, he reached slowly into his coat and withdrew something small. Lucas squinted through the darkness until he realized what it was. A flare gun. The stranger raised it toward the sky, and before the wolves could react, he pulled the trigger. A burst of searing orange light shot upward, exploding into a shower of sparks that illuminated the forest like daylight. The wolves yelped, startled, and scattered back into the shadows, disappearing into the underbrush with frantic speed. The pack had not been defeated, but it had been driven off. For now, Lucas's body sagged with relief, though the pain in his broken legs spiked violently from the sudden release of tension. He drew in a sharp breath, trembling and exhausted. The flare's dying embers drifted down like falling fireflies, casting flickers of amber light across the rocks where he hid. The stranger approached with cautious steps, raising his hands slightly to show he was not a threat. "You're hurt," he said quietly, his voice roughened by cold and fatigue. Lucas nodded weakly. He tried to speak, but his throat felt raw and swollen, and only a hoarse whisper escaped. The stranger knelt beside him, shining a small flashlight over his injuries. His brow tightened with concern. "You're lucky I saw the smoke from the crash," the man murmured. "Another hour and those wolves would have torn you apart." Lucas studied the stranger's rugged face, lined with fatigue, worn by the wilderness, yet somehow calm and focused. He looked like someone who had seen survival firsthand. "Name's Elijah Reed," he said, adjusting his backpack and checking Lucas's pulse. "I'm a forest guide. Been tracking this area for years." Elijah's presence felt both grounding and unsettling. Lucas thanked God silently, but questions swirled in his mind. What was a guide doing this deep in the wilderness at night? Why had he come alone? And how long had he been watching? Elijah began inspecting Lucas's broken leg with gentle, deliberate movements. Lucas winced as pain shot up his thigh, gripping the stone beside him to steady himself. "Bones not clean," Elijah observed. "Could have been worse, though. We'll need to splint it before moving you." Lucas nodded, grateful for the assistance, but overwhelmed by the agony. Elijah tore fabric from his own coat, wrapping Lucas's leg with steady precision. The wolves howled in the distance, a long, mournful cry that echoed through the treetops. Lucas stiffened at the sound. "They'll be back," Elijah warned. "Wolves don't give up a wounded meal, and you're bleeding enough to draw them from miles." The forest seemed to constrict around them again. Elijah worked quickly, constructing a makeshift splint using fallen branches and the fabric he carried. Lucas clenched his jaw to keep from crying out as Elijah secured the bindings. "I know it hurts," Elijah said without looking up. "But we have to move before the pack regroups." When he finished, he took a moment to look Lucas directly in the eyes. "Listen carefully. I'm going to carry you. But it won't be easy. You'll need to hold on no matter how much it hurts. Can you do that?" Lucas nodded hesitantly. His body was weak, but his will to survive, his trust in God, gave him strength he didn't understand. Elijah slid an arm beneath Lucas's shoulders and another beneath his knees, lifting him with effort. Lucas gasped from the pain, gripping Elijah's jacket tightly as they began to move. Every step jostled his shattered leg, and every jolt threatened to drag him into unconsciousness. Elijah's breathing grew heavy as he maneuvered around rocks and roots, careful to keep Lucas steady. Above them, the last traces of flare light faded, plunging the forest into darkness once more. Moonlight filtered through the branches in pale silver streams. "There's a cabin about 2 miles from here," Elijah said between breaths. "Old ranger station. We can make it if we move fast." Lucas felt his visions swim, but forced himself to remain alert. The wolves' howls grew louder again, forming a chorus of hunger that threaded through the night. As Elijah pushed forward, Lucas buried his face into the man's shoulder, whispering silent prayers with every breath. The forest was alive around them, branches snapping, leaves rustling, shadows moving. The pack was regrouping, following the scent of blood with renewed determination. Lucas heard them. Paws pounding the earth, low growls rising like thunder just beyond the trees. Elijah quickened his pace, his footsteps urgent. Lucas clung to him, tears stinging his eyes from pain and fear. God had sent help, but the danger hadn't passed. In the frozen wilderness, surrounded by starving predators, one truth became clear. Survival would demand everything they had, and more. Elijah Reed pushed forward through the undergrowth, his breath steaming in the icy air as he carried Lucas Warren in his arms. The forest, though silent only moments before, now pulsed with a tension so thick it felt alive. Behind them, the low growls of the wolves rose again, closer, angrier, more determined than before. Lucas forced himself to stay awake, though pain hammered relentlessly through his leg and exhaustion weighed heavily on his eyelids. His mind drifted in and out of fog, but one truth anchored him. Elijah was his only chance. Every step the man took echoed with desperation. Every jolt of Lucas's broken leg sent fire shooting through his nerves. He whispered silent prayers into the cold night air, clinging to hope as the chase tightened behind them. Elijah knew the terrain, but moving through it while carrying an injured man pushed his endurance to the breaking point. The old ranger cabin was still over a mile away, and with the wolves following their blood trail, even a mile felt like eternity. The trees thinned briefly, opening into a narrow clearing drenched in moonlight. Elijah hesitated. Crossing an open space made them visible, vulnerable, but there was no time to seek another route. He tightened his grip on Lucas and sprinted forward. Lucas felt every impact as Elijah's feet struck the frozen ground. His teeth clenched to stop himself from crying out, but a pained groan escaped anyway. The forest answered instantly. A chorus of snarls erupted from the darkness behind them. A wolf burst into the clearing, its fur bristled, its teeth bared, its eyes locked onto the two men. Elijah spun toward it, shielding Lucas with his body as he reached for the flare gun at his belt. The wolf lunged. Elijah fired. A burst of crimson light illuminated the clearing, throwing enormous shadows across the snow. The wolf veered back, yelping at the sudden brightness. But this flare was weaker than the first. Elijah had used his final shot. As the glow faded, the forest fell silent for a heartbeat. Then another wolf appeared. Then another. And another. Lucas counted at least 4 shadows closing in. The pack had regrouped completely, and now they were surrounding them on all sides. "Hold on," Elijah whispered through clenched teeth, his voice trembling not with fear, but with pure physical exertion. He shifted Lucas's weight and bolted toward the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing. The wolves surged forward in response, their paws pounding the earth in a rhythmic thunder that grew louder with every second. They were no longer stalking. They were attacking. Lucas forced his fading vision to focus. The trees ahead offered some hope of cover, but the distance seemed impossible. Elijah was slowing down, each breath a ragged gasp. Lucas knew he had to do something, anything, or they would both die before reaching the cabin. "Put me down." Lucas managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. Elijah ignored him, pressing on. Lucas shook his head weakly. "You won't make it carrying me." Elijah growled a frustrated breath, but the truth of Lucas's words was undeniable. The pack was gaining fast. Finally, he lowered Lucas behind a fallen log, quickly positioning branches around him to create makeshift cover. "I'm not leaving you," Elijah said, panting heavily. "But I need to draw them away long enough for us to reach the cabin." Lucas grabbed Elijah's sleeve, panic flaring in his chest. "They'll kill you." Elijah met his eyes with a grim, unwavering resolve. "Not if God's still watching over us." Elijah rose and sprinted across the clearing in the opposite direction, shouting and waving his arms to draw the wolves' attention. It worked. The pack split. 3 wolves veered toward Elijah, snarling as they chased him into the trees. But 2 remained fixed on Lucas, following the scent of his blood. Lucas's heart thudded painfully in his chest as the wolves prowled closer, their movements slow and deliberate now. They didn't need to rush. He could barely move. The broken leg throbbed violently, and every breath felt like inhaling cold blades. Lucas reached for a branch beside him. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. He whispered a shaky prayer, asking God not for rescue, but for strength to hold on a little longer. The nearest wolf stepped over the fallen log, its hot breath puffing white mist into the air. Lucas tightened his grip on the branch. His pulse roared in his ears. The wolf growled, lowering itself into a crouch, preparing to strike. Lucas braced himself. Then, suddenly, a deafening crack shattered the night. A tree branch overhead snapped and crashed to the forest floor, slamming between Lucas and the wolves. Snow exploded upward from the impact. The wolves leaped back in alarm, their snarls momentarily silenced. Lucas stared at the fallen branch, stunned. It had broken at the exact moment he needed it most. Whether it was coincidence or something more, he didn't know. But it bought him precious seconds. From deeper in the woods came Elijah's voice. "Lucas, move if you can." Lucas groaned, dragging himself forward with his arms. Pain tore through him like wildfire, but adrenaline and desperation overpowered it. He crawled across the snow, leaving a thin trail of blood behind. Elijah emerged through the trees moments later, panting and bruised, wielding a broken branch like a spear. "They're regrouping," he said, kneeling beside Lucas. "We have to get to that cabin now." Elijah lifted him again, this time with urgency, not caution, and dashed toward the tree line where the forest grew denser. Behind them, the wolves howled in fury, enraged by their lost advantage. Branches whipped against Elijah's face as he pushed through the brush. Snow clung to his clothes, weighing him down. Lucas clung to consciousness, his eyes half open, his breath ragged. Up ahead, Elijah spotted the faint outline of the ranger cabin, a dark, crooked shape half buried in snow, its windows shattered, its door hanging crookedly. It wasn't safety, but it was shelter. "We're almost there," Elijah shouted. The wolves burst from the trees behind them at that exact moment, their growls erupting like thunder. Elijah's muscles trembled violently as he sprinted the last stretch, forcing every ounce of strength left in his body to fight through the burning fatigue. With one final surge, Elijah reached the cabin's doorway and shoved Lucas inside. The wolves lunged the same second, their jaws snapping inches from Elijah's back. Elijah slammed the door shut with his shoulder, the wood splintering under impact as the wolves hurled themselves against it. Lucas lay on the floor, gasping, watching as Elijah dragged a rusted metal filing cabinet across the room and wedged it against the door just as the wolves crashed into it again. The cabin shook with every strike, but the barrier held. For the first time since the crash, Lucas felt himself exhale. They were still trapped, still freezing, still hunted, but they were alive. And as Elijah collapsed beside him, exhausted and trembling, Lucas understood. The fight for survival was not over, but together they finally had a chance. When dawn finally crept over the cabin, its weak light revealed the full extent of what Lucas Warren and Elijah Reed had endured. Lucas lay on a makeshift bed of old blankets, his legs splintered with torn boards Elijah had scavenged. The wolves still prowled outside, pacing back and forth through the snow, but their once relentless fury had weakened. Hours had passed, hours in which Lucas drifted in and out of consciousness, while Elijah kept the fire alive and listened for any sign of rescue. Yet even in his haze, Lucas understood the miracle of their survival. He had crawled from a plane crash with a shattered leg, dragged himself through a forest filled with hunger-driven predators, and clung to life with nothing but willpower and the strength of the man who refused to abandon him. It was a story no one would believe unless they saw the scars with their own eyes. The rescue team arrived just before noon. A pair of rangers who had followed the smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. They burst through the snowy clearing with rifles raised, shouting and scattering the wolves that had kept vigil through the night. Elijah opened the cabin door, exhaustion etched deeply into his face, but his relief was unmistakable. When the rangers carried Lucas out on a stretcher, he didn't feel fear anymore. He didn't feel the cold or the pain. He felt gratitude, raw, overwhelming gratitude. Not just toward Elijah, who had carried him, fought for him, and almost died for him, but also toward the invisible thread of fate that had allowed him to endure long enough to be found. The world looked different from that stretcher, brighter somehow, as though surviving the night had rewired something inside him. In the weeks that followed, as Lucas healed in a hospital bed, the doctors marveled at his ordeal. Reporters wanted interviews. Survival experts analyzed every detail of the wolf encounter, but none of them understood the truth. Not fully. They saw a man who survived against the odds. Lucas felt something deeper. He realized that survival was not just a physical act, but a spiritual one. It was the quiet choice to take one more breath when everything around him said to give up. It was the unspoken pact between two strangers who refused to let the other die in the snow. And as Lucas Warren looked out the hospital window at the winter sky, He understood that the wolves, the crash, the darkness, none of it would define him. What defined him was the strength he found when there was no strength left, and the reminder that even in the coldest, loneliest night, survival is possible when someone believes you are worth saving.